Hello and welcome to episode 181 of Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty. Of course, I am your host, Rick Doherty. I'm so excited for this week's conversation. I'll be joined by Catherine Mayer and Greg Glasgow, the married couple who took advantage of their time together in the early days of the pandemic to research and write the book Disneyland on the Mountain, Walt, the Environmentalists, and the Ski Resort That Never Was. I want to get right to this conversation, so I just want to take a quick second to ask that everybody like and comment on this episode on the Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty YouTube channel. Also, if you aren't subscribed, I would really appreciate you taking just a few seconds to click that subscribe button. Next month, the D23 Expo in Anaheim, California will come with so many announcements related to the Disney parks, and you aren't going to want to miss our takes on those things. I would also love if some of you would make your way over to the YouTube channel to check out some of our videos, specifically a longer vlog that aired on June 30th. Along with my wife Courtney and my friend Jillian, I set the goal of hitting all 4 Walt Disney World theme parks in a day to celebrate my birthday. This wasn't the first time I hit all 4 parks in a day. In fact, I once hit all 4 Walt Disney World parks and the 2 dry parks at Universal Orlando Resort in the same day. Still, this year we hit a lot of different attractions, met a lot of different characters, and tried a lot of great food during this marathon day. I think you'll enjoy following along with our ventures. Right now, let's welcome Catherine Mayer and Greg Glasgow to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us. We're so excited to speak with you.
Absolutely. Thanks.
So you are the authors of Disneyland on the Mountain, Walt, the Environmentalists, and the Ski Resort That Never Was. So we focus a lot on different Disney theme parks and different Disney things, and I think there's sort of a graveyard of lost Disney projects all over the globe. In Australia, Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, there was Disney's America, the theme park that was going to be created. But this is sort of the original killed project from Disney. Before we get to why it didn't work and some of the innovations that still came out of this, what was this going to be?
Absolutely. This was going to be, and when you say the graveyard of Disney projects, what's so interesting about this is because this is Walt Disney himself. So this really was one of the original killed Disney projects, which makes it so interesting because it was so important to Walt. And this was something he really wanted. So this was going to be in a place called Mineral King, California. And that place was and is, it was at the time right by Sequoia National Park, right outside of that area. And spoiler alert, now it is in Sequoia National Park. But it was going to be a ski resort, yes, but it was also really going to be this outdoor all year round recreation area. So Walt really envisioned this as a place where people could come. Yes, they could go ski, but they could go hiking and they could bike and they could go swimming and do all kinds of things like that, have wilderness walks. And he really also saw this as somewhere that people could really enjoy that area and basically get educated on the outdoors. Disneyland was great, but it was man-made. This was kind of like a Disneyland, but this was all natural. And there were also going to be other entertainment things that was going to be going on, including there were going to be movie theater, which of course was going to play the latest Disney flicks, and a number of different fun restaurants and things like that, and some entertainment as well, which also included something that a lot of Disney folks are familiar with called the Country Bear Jamboree. So it was really going to be something, I think, that celebrated the outdoors and celebrated wilderness, but also really entertained people as well. And I think it was going to be one of those places that was just always going to be getting built and built, and we would kind of see how that evolved later on. But yeah, really kind of this outdoor recreation wonderland, I think.
And that's so interesting. Obviously, I was going to bring up later that the Country Bear Jamboree was originally written, designed, and thought up for this resort in the mountains. And like so many of the canceled Disney projects, we ended up getting something out of it. We got Country Bear Jamboree eventually in Walt Disney World. We had it in Disneyland for a while as well. But, they never seem to let something really die. If they're going to come up with these ideas, they try to continue to preserve them. And that is one of the things that came out of this failed project. What was it that really started the process of the failure of this resort?
Started the process of the failure. I think one of the big things that happened, unfortunately, was that Walt died just about a year into the planning of this. So it was announced in 1965. Walt died in 1966. And that, kind of threw a wrench into things just because this was such a passion project for him. And because really what killed this project ultimately was the environmental resistance to it. So there was a big conservation movement obviously happening at the time in the 60s and 70s. And they really spoke out about this development pretty early on, but it really hadn't reached kind of that fever pitch until after Walt died. And that's when it really got bad. And we think that, Walt being Walt maybe would have been able to salvage part of it, maybe would have been able to talk to people on his level and understand the concerns and try to work around them. But some of the leadership that followed wasn't necessarily as committed to the project. I mean, they wanted to finish it for Walt because it was his thing, but they didn't necessarily think it fit into the Disney kind of business model. They said, we're a movie company, we're a theme park company, we don't really do skiing. So that was kind of probably the biggest push. And then once the environmental resistance began with it, I mean, that's what really ultimately caused it to fail.
I would love to get into that environmental resistance at some point, but I think first of all, do you feel that the creation of Walt Disney World, which was happening basically at the same time, and you have the creation of Walt Disney World, which at that point was just called the Florida Project, you have this resort that they're working on in the mountains, and then Walt dies. Was that just too much for the company to deal with at one time, where maybe Walt could have had these conversations, had these, difficult negotiations with environmentalists, but when you're spinning so many plates and the main plate spinner is gone, you just have to start to prioritize a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that, yeah, Walt's death was, obviously it hit the company extremely hard. It was, for the most part, unexpected and very quick, as a lot of Disney people know. And when he passed away, part of the Mineral King idea, in a way, died along with him, because again, this was really his baby. And what's important to note about all this was that Walt considered himself a conservationist, and he really loved the outdoors. He loved wilderness. He loved animals. And this was something like he said numerous times in interviews and in company memos and things like that, that he was so excited about this, like more so than most other projects that he had worked on. He really thought this Mineral King, California area was incredibly beautiful, and he wanted more people to see it because it was extremely difficult to get to, still is to this day. And so this would have made this area really accessible. So this was something that he was so passionate about. So I think when he did pass away, it was just really difficult. And because he had that background as being a conservationist as well, I think that he again could have negotiated, could have really calmed down some of these fears that people were having, because this was not lip service. He really was extremely passionate about this. And I think, there were rumblings about some of that environmental pushback. But again, like Greg had mentioned, it really did reach that fever pitch after Walt had died. So things, it would have been so interesting. And that's one of the sad parts about this story is, what really would have happened if Walt still lived. And I think things probably could have been possibly different.
I'll just add, there was a little bit of a difference between the projects and the fact that in Florida, Disney purchased all the land for Disney World, so they're able to go in and start building right away. In Mineral King, this was land they were leasing from the Forest Service. So the way that this worked was when they first got the rights to build it in 65, they basically had a 3-year planning permit. So they had 3 years to put together, to go in, do research, put together an actual final plan. And then that's when they could actually start building. So they didn't really have the means to go in and develop and do a lot of construction and things like that in Mineral King like they did in Florida, which is another, to your point, probably reason why that Florida project got a lot more attention and, dedication at that point, because they could actually start building it as opposed to Mineral King.
And when you talk about some of the questions about would this succeed both in the public but in the company, because they were a theme park and a movie company at the time, but as you have seen the growth in the Disney company, and now with theme parks like Disney's Animal Kingdom that's 100% focused on conservation, and the fact that in Florida they own so much protected land to go along with everything they build. And if they build something new, they have to buy more protected land to make up for it. When you see that they can sort of balance these things now, and they have moved into a resort business model that isn't just theme park resorts where there's Vero Beach and Alani. So this was really ahead of its time when it came to the Walt Disney Company, because they do a lot of things like this now.
Yeah, in a way, it's kind of a shame to think about. I mean, if you go back in time and think when this was happening, 1965, it would have been the second Disney thing. So, when they opened Walt Disney World as their second big project like this, in a way, it sort of locked them in, at least for quite a while, to the theme park business, the movie business. But I mean, think about what would have happened had they opened a ski resort as their second big experiential thing right after Disneyland had opened in 55. So it makes you think. But yeah, I mean, you're 100% right that it's like this project maybe would have spurred them to do resort stuff earlier. I mean, now they're in cruise ships as well, things like that. So it's interesting to think about how much more they could have potentially added more variety to their business model had they done that. And it's interesting, all the protected land in Disney World you're talking about, that all kind of came directly out of Mineral King. There was a kind of environmental council they put together for the Mineral King project to kind of appease some of these fears that environmentalists were having. And they brought those folks in on Disney World as well. And I mean, having seen all the uproar that was happening in California with this ski resort project, they made sure they really paid attention to that aspect of it in Florida.
So I want to get more into the personal side, and why was this a topic that the two of you wanted to tackle? I mean, this is a lot of research to go into a book like this, when you're talking about doing the research for a project that never ended up coming to fruition. So it had to be a big passion project of yours.
You're right. It was a lot. It was a lot of research, obviously, on something that happened and so long ago too, because it was hard to nail down people that were also are still living. But we were able to actually, there are people who are heavily involved in the story that are still living, that we were very lucky and fortunate to speak to. And yeah, the research was its own incredible lift, of course. But as far as the personal side of it, I definitely grew up as a Disney person. I still am a Disney person to this day. So I did grow up, especially, yes, with the movies, yes, with the shows, all that stuff. But the experiential stuff, the theme parks, that was always kind of my bread and butter of Disney fandom, I would say. And as I got older, especially, I was very, very interested in Disney history and company history. And of course, finding out about some of those parks and projects and things like that that never happened. And of course, having the original one, essentially, and the one that really shaped so much of who Walt really was and what the company was about and who and what the company has really become because of Mineral King was just really so fascinating to me and really to us as well. We had a few years back, we were in San Francisco and we went to the Walt Disney Family Museum. And if I don't know if anyone, I don't know if you've been there, it's amazing. And there's a really big timeline of Walt Disney's life, and it had this very small mention of Mineral King. And it also mentions that the partner on Walt Disney's Mineral King project was a man named Willie Schaeffler. And Willie Schaeffler was a famous skier and the head ski coach at the University of Denver. And that's where I went to school. Greg and I had both worked there. That's how we met. So that also kind of piqued our interest in terms of, wait, there's also this interesting Denver connection, this Colorado connection, and how does Willie Schaeffler fit into this? So it was that combination of things too that kind of we basically became obsessive about it and wanting to find out all of this huge story and realizing, okay, this wasn't just one point Disney tried and failed to build this ski resort. This was an incredible story and had so much controversy to it. Really ties into, again, who the company is today, and realizing that this story was never fully told. And there was certainly no book about it or anything like that. So it was really a genuine thing. We were very obsessive about it. And we're also we're writers by trade and journalists by trade. So kind of was hopefully a natural fit and something we're extremely grateful that we were able to tell the story.
And that's interesting that you bring up that Walt brought in this accomplished skier, because if somebody's watched the Imagineering story on Disney Plus or read about some of these other things that were created in the theme parks, like at Disneyland especially, a lot of times the beginning of Imagineering, they were pulling movie makers and saying, guess what? Now you're making theme park rides.
Yeah.
But for this project, he went to experts to try to make sure this was going to be successful. And I think the $1 million question that I want to ask you is, do you think this would have been successful had they gotten it off the ground? Do you think they would have been able to make this a destination for people that would have been both environmentally and economically viable?
That's a great question. I mean, it's Disney, so the chances are good that they would have. I will say the location is pretty remote. I mean, one of the reasons they wanted to do it was because it was sort of equidistant from LA and San Francisco, maybe a few hours either way, but it's pretty far away. So it's not as easy as, driving over to Anaheim or flying into John Wayne Airport and taking a 30-minute Uber ride. It would have taken a lot more, but, skiers, I think, are used to that. I mean, there was so much enthusiasm for it. I think that's the other thing that's interesting to us is the wide, sort of accepted, like Catherine was saying, story of Mineral King, if you read about it at all in a Disney biography or something, was, they tried and failed to do this. There was some environmental resistance, and that was kind of the end of the story. But with all our research, we found that there were tons of skiers, tons of course, business people in that area that were really excited about it. So I think had it worked out the way they wanted it to from the beginning, which would have involved building a new highway to go into this area, potentially adding other transportation options like trains and things like that. But, I think it would have been really cool and really ahead of its time. A lot of the stuff they were talking about is kind of standard for ski resorts these days, as far as, year-round activities, things happening in the summer, restaurants, hotels. But a lot of that stuff wasn't super common especially in the US at that time, like in the 60s. So I think it would have been a pretty unique thing. And I think they could have made it work and made it profitable.
And I think in terms of like in ski circles as well, and some of the experts, for instance, like Willie Schaeffler, who they did bring in, he said later in his life that this was his biggest regret in his life. And he had gone to Olympics, I mean, championships, all this kinds of stuff. And he said this was like the one thing that broke his heart, essentially, was that this didn't happen. And I think that's kind of says a lot, that a lot of people who had, you know, these incredibly high calibers of skiing and experts, that they really had wanted this to happen. They thought it was going to be something, again, like Greg said, it was so ahead of its time. This would have set the bar for every other ski resort that later came to be. And in some ways that is still what happened, even though this was never built. So I think that's kind of interesting to mention. And they even envisioned, when they were talking about this, they were like, we're going to have Winter Olympics here. We're so excited about this. It's going to be a slam dunk for people. And not just skiers, I will say that too, is because they also thought that this was going to draw the attention of non-skiers as well. Yes, it was important to the ski industry and winter sports in general, but they also thought this was going to be this wonderful vacation destination. I'm sure it would have been a success.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way on God's green earth you're going to get me on a pair of skis. But in addition to the theme parks, and I love that Disney quality that they bring to everything, but I'm also an active hiker. I love to, get out into the woods and hit the trails. And it feels like this would have had a lot of those type of activities where maybe, what Disney does best when they're at their best is almost anybody in the family can do it. So you would take something like hiking that would be, risky at least for most people who are inexperienced, and make it a more accessible experience. At least that's what I'm guessing would have happened. And you might have more insight into that.
Yeah, I think if you've been to like the Redwood Challenge Trail at California Adventure, that's sort of maybe what we think might have been like. But I think, and they really wanted to appeal to all levels. So I think they would have had, for skiing, they would have had Black Diamond, really hardcore courses for experienced skiers, but also great hills for novices. And probably the same thing with hiking. They probably would have had some guided experiences, roped off areas, very guided trail. Then they would have had more extreme stuff. And it's just so interesting, because to think that there was this sort of environmental resistance to this when so much of it was meant to be a celebration of the environment. And I mean, people love to go to Mineral King, the Sierra Club in particular, because it was such a great area for hiking and for, mountaineering and fishing and all that kind of stuff, all of which would have been part of Mineral King. I mean, I think obviously the concern was largely just the amount of people that it was going to bring in and that sort of thing. But it's kind of sad in a way that they were so at odds, because it's like their ultimate goals were so similar. They both wanted people to come up and to be able to celebrate the environment in this beautiful place. They just had sort of very different thoughts about how to make that happen.
Well, it's the never-ending problem, right? When you're trying to show off nature and you want to get people interested in the environment, in getting out into the woods, but you can't get too many people interested, or else it starts to become too much like a city. So that's going to be a back and forth that's going to exist as long as this type of tourism exists.
100%. I think that's the crux of so much of that controversy back then, and it still is today. Absolutely. So it's one of those things too. I mean, when you look at it both ways, is sure, maybe it's sad because we're going to mar the area a little bit. It's going to be changed. It's going to be different, but people can't enjoy that area if, they're not extremely athletic types, if they can't get up to that area, for instance, if they don't have certain lodging. Not everyone is able or athletic or of a certain age that they could, pitch a tent and sleep outdoors. I think also to enjoy the area, you also have to make it accessible. So again, it is one of those kind of things and arguments that, I mean, people could argue about every day, every year, and this will probably never go away.
And I just want to get back to the personal a little bit and talk about the development of your love for Disney. When did it start? Was it going to Disneyland? Was it the movies? What made you, first of all, a lover of this company and then getting interested in this lost project?
Oh boy. For me, I mean, I don't remember my life without Disney. That is, I am a child of the 80s and the 90s. And so for me, it was, some of the first movies, definitely, certainly during that Renaissance, but also, of course, watching all the, Snow White and Pinocchio and Cinderella, everything. And my first trip to Walt Disney World was in the 80s. I was 4 years old. And every few years, whenever it worked out for our family, that's where we went. That's always where we went. And then my family had moved to Colorado. We continue to go to Walt Disney World. But then also there was Disneyland in the mix. And so I was East Coast first, before going to the original park. And then Greg and I, obviously we got married. We're a married couple, and I kind of brought him into the fold, but I could let him kind of speak to his own Disney fandom. But yeah, for me, so it was always there. And then I also became a business reporter as well. And so for me, again, that like company history deep into what drives a company, what is making it successful, is always so fascinating to me as well.
Yeah, I mean, like Catherine said, she definitely brought me into the fold, and I was somewhat of a Disney fan, but didn't really know how deep it could go. And, really going to the parks, I think, is the thing that really starts to cement that real love and that real sense of like the magic of Disney. And then, finding, like Catherine said, finding this project, finding that DU connection, and just the timing of it all worked out well because, we sort of felt like the project found us in a way. We weren't thinking like, oh, we should really write a book together. It's just this came about, and we looked and we kind of like, how come no one's written a book about this? It's so fascinating. The more we looked into it and realized it was this, 20-year environmental battle. There was a case that went to the Supreme Court, had so much to do with the foundation of modern environmental law and modern day Disney. And it just seems so interesting. And it also happened to be a lot of it during COVID. So it's kind of like it gave us this positive thing to focus on. And we also knew that there's a huge Disney fandom out there. So, were we to write a book, it's like writing a book that already has kind of this built-in fan base and a built-in audience of people that we know is hungry for these untold stories. I think also, added to that appeal of, hey, if we write this, there might actually be, we might actually sell some books because there's people that want to know more about this story.
Yeah, and you mentioned, a court case going to the Supreme Court and all the legal battles. And I definitely wanted to have a thorough interview with you, but not blow too many of the secrets. I wanted to give plenty of reasons to still go out and read this book. And believe me, there are plenty of things that are still to be discovered about this story. It's a very, very interesting story. And Catherine, I wanted to get back to you being a business reporter. So when you're coming at this and covering a company that you've loved since you've been 4 years old. Like, I went to Walt Disney World my first time when I was 5. I think we're dealing with about the same age range. I brought my wife into it like you brought your husband into it. And I have this podcast, and I love Disney. I love Walt Disney World. I've been going since I was 5, taking trips across the country to go see Disneyland. But sometimes when you're talking about these things and you're trying not to be too much of a Pollyanna, you have to be realistic about some of the things you think are good decisions, some of the things that you think aren't good decisions. How do you balance that? Like, was it difficult to, start to look at some of these things? The Mark Twain quote that if you get a job you like, you'll never work a day in your life is such a
Mhm.
lie, because once something becomes a job or becomes a heavy interest like this,
Mhm.
you start to see behind the curtain a little bit. Do you
Yeah.
find that as you've seen behind the curtain, it's lessened the magic, or you're still just as into it as you were at the beginning?
Oh, I love this question. I think, I mean, I view my relationship to Disney like I would view my relationship to any important person in my life. Like, that's how big it is. And with every relationship, there are flaws. Things are not, it is not, I do not have my rose colored glasses on all the time. I think to really have an important relationship, you have to see both sides. And, there are times when things are not so great. And then there are times when things are a lot better. And I think, in having a relationship that has spanned decades with this company, you've had like kind of crappy times. And I've seen things that have happened that you certainly do not love. But also from a journalist point of view and as a writer, I also take that role extremely seriously. So I almost was hesitant to even say I came into this like I was a Disney person, because I also wanted my role as a journalist to be extremely important and fair and balanced, because that's how I view that role. And so that was actually one of the first things that we discovered. And that's when it became kind of a natural way for us to tell the stories, when we're like, there are two extreme sides to this story, and they both have a lot of merit. We talked to people on both sides of this argument, and we researched it from that angle. So for us, it was extremely important to weigh both of those sides extremely equally. And basically we switch points of view each time. Like some chapters we're basically coming from the perspective of the Disney company. At other points we're coming from the perspective of the environmentalists who are opposed to this project. And that was also extremely interesting to us to learn more about that other side of it. But again, we really wanted to come at that as very balanced. And so I think that was the bigger goal, and that was beyond my background and my history with the Disney company. Was I'm going to put my role as a journalist above that.
Before I started this podcast, I worked in sports radio for a number of 11 years. And I just think of being at a sporting event and watching my team like lose a devastating loss, but
Mhm.
keeping that face
Yeah.
stone cold so nobody can tell. Like, you're trying to take your emotions out of it and cover it in this way that is completely and totally fair, because with every disappointment, somebody's excited,
Yeah.
and you just sort of have to put aside those emotions when you're doing it, and then maybe, when you're back home later, sort of reflect on that other stuff. Such a great answer. This has been an amazing conversation. Everybody who listens to this podcast loves Disney, and we don't just love it at that, superficial level. Like, we love the details, we love the inertia, the ins and outs. So Disneyland on the Mountain, Walt, the Environmentalists, and the ski resort that never was. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, bookshop.org. You can find this so many different places. DisneylandOnTheMountain.com. So thank you so much for joining us. This was an amazing conversation.
Thank you so much, Rick. We
Yeah,
so
thank
appreciate
you.
this.
Yeah, great questions and great conversation.
I don't talk about this much, but I actually host 2 podcasts, and I'm also a DJ on an internet radio station. In both of those gigs, I get to do a lot of interviews with authors, musicians, and other people who put new creations out into the world. I love to hear about and talk about the creative process. So it was such a thrill to have Catherine and Greg on the show. This has been episode 181 of Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty. We'll be back next Thursday with another brand new episode. Until then, have a great week.